Welcome to the Kind Mind Podcast. I'm Todd, and our very special guest today is Marianne Williamson, who's a best-selling author of books like A Return to Love, which was influential in my life when I was a younger seeker of wisdom. And she's a prominent spiritual thinker with an admirable career of social activism. And of course, that now includes running for the Democratic nomination for president in the last two elections. What I've appreciated about Marianne's voice in the political arena is her moral courage to address the root causes of social issues and taking a nuanced and holistic approach that I think our country is starving for in the assessment of these various crises, like wealth inequality to health inequality to the devastating, obscene levels of violence in the world and the geopolitical risk that's gripping the world and the planet, and her willingness to engage in the real healing and repair associated with systemic wrongs and injustices. So I hope to reflect on some of that, as well as the new book that Marianne has released. So, Marianne, thank you so much for the gift of your time today. It means a lot to me. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for the words you just spoke. I think we all like to feel seen, and I really appreciate that you see and that you acknowledged what my campaign and what my work in that area has tried to be a more holistic, whole person, integrative root cause approach. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I would encourage my listeners to still visit your campaign website, which I believe is marianne24.com,
24.com. Yeah.
because the platform is laid out so well. And if you haven't thought about it in this way, it still is very important, I think, for us to think about these issues holistically.
Thank you.
Marianne, your new book is The Mystic Jesus. Now, on the surface, I think that sounds like a pretty big shift from thinking so macro to thinking about a specific individual. But the subtitle, The Mind of Love, really does orient readers, and for me so far in the book, to the deeper message of your campaign. But how do you see this book as timed now, and what does it mean to you in the context of your wider work as your next spiritual expression?
Well, actually, the book was written before I ran for president, but for understandable reasons, neither the publisher nor I thought releasing that book during a presidential campaign would be a very good idea. In terms of why I'm interested in both the external and the internal change, is because that's how I see the world. You know, Martin Luther King said that in order to create the beloved community, we need to have quantitative changes in material circumstances, but also qualitative shifts in our souls. And if you read the nonviolent philosophy of Gandhi, of King, and so forth, the idea, of course, here is, just as we all know the line when Gandhi said, we must be the change. The reason we must be the change is because otherwise the change won't happen. He said the end is inherent in the means. You know, everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. So I never in my life or in my work thought that policy issues, politics, and so forth didn't matter. I just saw them as I see them now, as treating the symptom, but not necessarily addressing root cause. And my work with people on a spiritual level, on a psychological level, seemed to me where my, whatever skill I have might be best put to use. But I saw a shift in my own career over a period of about 20 years that startled me, because when my career began in the 1980s, I was one of those people who thought, yeah, just vote Democratic and more than not, things will be okay. But I began to see things, and the way it showed up for me when I was an AIDS activist and I was working very up close and personal with people during the AIDS crisis, as horrible as it was, and then I began working more and more with people going through the most agonizing chapters of their lives. But still, there was a sense that this crisis was the exception and not the rule. Around the year 2000, I started seeing a fundamental shift because remember, I travel a lot, I talk to people a lot, and I began to encounter people all over the country for whom the crisis was the rule and not the exception. So the problem, for instance, wasn't just that they had cancer. The problem was that they didn't have health care. The problem wasn't just that they needed a job. The problem was that they needed three jobs in order to support their family. So I began to see that no amount of personal counseling, faith, charity, uh, prayer, all of which I was very involved in. I was already very involved as a nonprofit activist. I was already very involved, obviously, on the level of faith, et cetera, could compensate for the fact that the society had become so ruthless towards people who didn't have material means and who were sort of locked out from such a young age from attaining them. I saw a shift. And that's when I thought, no, we have to talk about that too. But I never left my interest in the spiritual. So for me, when I was in college, I remember we used to read in the morning, you would read Ram Dass, you would read Alan Watts, you would read all, and then in the afternoon, you went to a
Awesome.
anti-war, Vietnam War protest. Nobody thought it was either or. It was a counterculture. It was everything. It was spiritual, it was political, it was sexual, it was musical, it was cultural. Nobody was talking about how you had to stay in your lane. What lane? We're multidimensional beings. And we have to take a multidimensional approach to transforming this world, or it won't change. We have to bring the fullness of ourselves. So to me, whether you're running for president or writing a book about Jesus, it's all about just fundamental shifts in the quality of our human experience.
But to that point that you're saying, like, we need to be able to participate. But lately, there is this not politics of love, but politics of fear, even
Yeah.
on the Democratic side, where fearing
Mm-hmm.
voices like yours. And for the party that really brands itself as the only path to equality, let's say, it's very hierarchical. So, what was that like then in your experience, bumping up to the machine, let's say, and really just wanting a fair chance to say, hey, here are my ideas. Can I at least present them to people?
Hierarchical is putting it very kindly. It has become a vicious, corrupt system. Um, During the 2020 campaign, yes, I was put over on the end of the debate stage. I was mocked unfairly in some ways, but
Right.
not anything that went outside the purview of, hey, you got in the kitchen, baby, there's going to be some heat. I felt, even in terms of exposure on CNN, MSNBC, et cetera, that for a minor candidate, I was given fair exposure. I had a CNN town hall and so forth. This time, a decision was made at the highest levels. Biden would be the candidate, and we will brook no disagreement with that. We will de-amplify along with our media partners and our donors, who are a lot of times on boards, et cetera. I mean, it was she will not be heard. She will be kicked off ballots. She will be denied access. She will be denied vendors. It was really extraordinary. Plus, they really they go after you, including character assassination, including infiltration of your campaigns. So I think that now that the Democrats have had such an extraordinary electoral defeat, um, the question before us is, will they be willing to look in the mirror? Will they be willing to recognize the corruption of their own process? It will be far better for America if they do, because that once again, the end is inherent in the means. A corrupt vessel will not bring us a sustainable future. I think what so many people are going through, and I think since the election, and I'm sure you'd agree just from the things you've already said, there's been a lot of waking up, a lot of growing up, and I think people are processing. Will the Democratic Party return to its commitment to genuine democracy? You don't suppress democracy to save democracy. Will it return to its quintessential values? Will it atone for its own errors? I don't know. But I know that you and I cannot go into a spiral of despair. Oh my God, what will we do if they don't? I think that as we change on the level of consciousness, new forms appear. So I think it's time for us to already have the conversation about integrated politics, about a whole person approach, about a 21st century solution to 21st century problems, as opposed to 20th century efforts and solutions to 21st century problems. And that's the phase we're in. We're in the phase of processing, observing on the ideational level. We don't have to worry too much right now. I mean, on 26, for me, it's pretty simple. And for 2026, just hopefully the Democrats will get back to House and the Senate. But it's got to be overall going
It's deeper
forward
than that.
something much deeper than that. And that's the conversations we're having. We don't have to worry about who, what, when, where. We don't have to worry about any of that right now. Let's just forge the deeper conversation. Just to complete with that, Werner Erhard said you can live your life one of two ways. You can either live your life according to circumstances or according to a vision. So let's just have the vision right now. Let's not be so attached to, if you're too attached to the circumstances right now, you almost can't breathe, you know? So just stand back. Let's have a vision
Well,
of
I
what's
saw this
possible.
coming from months and months away.
Well,
And you
I was
were
for a
right.
year
You
and
were
a
sounding
half.
the
We're not
alarms.
going to win. We're not going to win.
Right. And these are also the downstream effects of really the cumulative effect of the lack of three primaries in a row, right? Because you endorsed Bernie Sanders last time, and it really appears, I think, to a lot of us that for the party and the establishment, it is more important to defeat that economic populism than Donald Trump.
I felt during my campaign, there are people here who would rather lose to Trump than let me on the stage. That was very
I
clear to
agree with.
me.
I think that's an accurate assessment. I'm also concerned about these lessons actually getting absorbed, though, because it seems like there is a rush to misdiagnose Kamala's campaign, and the election autopsy has a lot of forensic flaws. I hear one interpretation being that, see, this is why you actually have to move right, and people blaming identity politics.
There's just no
But
facts to
only
back
Joe
that
out of the
up.
last three elections made any sort of promise towards some of the values and some of the positions that you were running on or Bernie Sanders was running on. And I don't think and then another thing is like the country's not ready for a woman like Kamala. But I think that's just lazy analysis. We
It's
need
more
to.
than lazy. And once again, I think you're being charitable. It's an analysis of those desperate to protect their perch,
Hmm.
because they are the operatives and they are the elite who preside over the situation as it is. And they're trying to protect their own power because they are purveyors of the centrists. They are purveyors of the donors, and they don't they don't want to move in any direction towards populism. It's interesting. It is what's going on now, of course. It's not left versus right. At the deepest level, it's the powerful versus the powerless. It's the populace staging a revolution against the establishment. Now, the Republican Party, largely because of Donald Trump, I don't think they would have done it otherwise, but to some extent they might have. They did with the Tea Party, et cetera. They have made room for the right-wing economic populists. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, does everything it can to peripheralize and suppress left-wing populism. It's almost, I feel sometimes like the Democratic Party is intent on shrinking its base. Look how
Well,
it
I
threw
think
away
that's a good
Bobby.
point.
Yeah, they threw away what Bobby had to say. In 2020, I was on the debate stage. I said we have a sickness care system, not a healthcare system. In order to address that, we have to look at food policies and chemical policies. If you
Right.
go back and look at that tape, Lester Holt says, "Let's get the camera off that woman as soon as possible." Right? Now, Bobby tried to run
I
as a
remember
Democrat.
that
Absolutely.
tragically.
So look at Bobby, to me, and so many of the things I talked about as well, were just diamonds that the Democratic Party just let fall to the floor, and Donald Trump said, "Okay, I'll take it." Picked it up, said, "Okay, I'll take it."
And they went a
You don't
lot
want to.
further with RFK. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. You go on.
Just to that point, I mean, they went very far with the censorship of RFK. I mean, he was actually banned previously from social media platforms, but um, de-amplified, as you said, and really made out to be like crazy and character
And many of the
assassinations
people.
galore. But I don't think you have to be a Jungian psychologist to appreciate the synchronicity between being silenced by the government for his views on health and now having been nominated to have the loudest voice on health. I mean, these are
Well,
archetypal inversions of
you know
rebel
what,
to
Todd?
ruler.
There's a line in the Course in Miracles that says, you create what you defend against. And that's true not only with the Bobby thing, but the whole left. It's like if you try
Hmm.
to suppress left-wing voices, they become, oh, this isn't even just about the left, it's about anything. What you
Right.
suppress becomes, you have to make room for people to get it right. But if you
It's
don't
like a
even let
well
them in the
buried
room,
seed.
yeah, yeah. And I also felt, despite the suppression, despite the uh, character assassination, really, I mean, it's unbelievable the narratives that they will spin. Quite unbelievable to be at the effect of that and see how it works. Um, Despite that, we got almost 500,000 votes, even having been kicked off certain ballots and so forth. Under normal
Yeah, that was
political,
impressive.
yeah, it is impressive, and I'm very grateful to all the people who made that happen. But the point is bigger than me. The point is that in politics, especially if you've got a close race, 500,000 votes should be deemed significant. Not only did I not receive a call, I continue to be treated as an enemy. It's so weird. What political party sees one of the candidates as an enemy rather than an opponent? It's crazy. And they wouldn't even give me a ticket to the convention. I mean,
Oh my
it's almost funny if you think about it. I remember being in some New England state. I think it was Vermont. It might have been Maine, but I think it was uh, Maine or Vermont during the campaign. And we went over to a Unity church. Now, I've been speaking at Unity churches for a long time in my career. They're this cool mix, of the universal spirituality and a kind of left-wing cool political perspective. Not only was I told that I couldn't speak there, I was truly treated like an enemy. How dare I? We have decided, the DNC decided it's going to be Biden. What are you doing? And I thought, what is going on here? I'm running for president. They had this canard that we don't primary incumbents, but I grew up at a time when Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy Sr. primaried Lyndon Johnson, an incumbent. And it was so important that they did because they brought to the table the conversation about ending the Vietnam War, which actually got Lyndon Johnson to even just quit and say, I'm not even going any further. You have to trust democracy. So once again, it's not about the person it happens to. It's about what it represents and people knowing that that is not what can happen and must not happen again going forward. And if those kinds of tricks continue to be played with whomever, the Bobby and Marianne chapter is past, but going forward. And if that's not the cultural shift, which it doesn't look like it's going to be, I don't know. We'll see who's the
No,
next head of the
I don't get that
DNC.
sense. Just based
No.
on the forensic flaws of the
Yeah,
campaign
yeah,
from the
yeah. I think
establishment.
what your points about the autopsy is absolutely correct, and that's unfortunate because then what do we do? I mean, some people talk about starting a third party, but you're talking about so many, really
Hmm.
hundreds of millions of dollars to
Well,
pull
in
that
this
off. So
duopoly, it's really hard uh, to get a true feel for what the votes mean. We don't have ranked choice voting. We don't have 30 viable parties. So it's just this side or that side, which is convenient, I would say, for the media establishment to portray every other side as the enemy
mhm.
and keep that contest going. But this politics of fear where there can't be conversation is
Oh yeah,
detrimental, right? Like
yes, and
Kamala
that's
couldn't go on
where
Joe Rogan because she couldn't dialogue. And they couldn't, and I think it conveyed to the American people, she can't make this decision for herself. It's as simple. You know what Joe Rogan does? Either go chat with them or don't, right? But the fact that they were trying to work it out told me that the consultants are trying to work it out. So then, even
yeah,
if she became
yeah,
president, we have a female president, a woman of color. But if she has to take all the orders from powerful men in the shadows, the consultants,
Yeah.
it that representation is hollow. And that, that
If,
we have to be able to get past.
if you're not running for president or really on a certain level doing anything because of a calling within your own gut, then you're not an authentic, there's no authenticity there. And people read that. The part of the brain that analyzes an issue is not the same part of the brain that decides who to vote for. How a person comes across, one thing you said about Donald Trump, there's a there's a way he speaks to people, and he did this on Joe Rogan. And what is so dangerous about him, but so fascinating, is that he speaks some truth, and then he'll throw in an outrageous lie. And then he gets back to some level where he's really speaking. But um, yes, that thing with her was
But then on the
absurd.
other side, it's like, what is so scary about her being able to just talk freely for 3 hours for the establishment, right? That a mistake could be made. So now we're censoring ourselves. We can't just talk. We can't just say, hey, I know I felt this way about fracking before. I felt this way about an issue, and here's how I've evolved. When she couldn't say one thing she would do differently from Joe Biden, I think that was kind of like an inflection point, a flashpoint in the whole campaign. Because a human being, of course, sees daylight between them and anybody. And if you can't say, no, I would do a lot of things different, or even 4 years not having, this the say
Well,
and
and also the idea, people said it was so hard for her. What's so hard? Al Gore was Bill Clinton's,
sure.
uh, uh, vice president. George Bush Sr. had been Ronald Reagan's vice president. So this idea that it's so hard to do, it's not so hard to do if you know in your gut what you feel. And I think the American people sometimes care less how you feel and more that you feel something, you stand for something. And I don't want to kick her. I mean, I have compassion for the woman as a woman. I mean, what she's going through, but um, nobody who is part of
Well, I do too,
that
because I think
that
that would be a
puppet show
totally
should be proud
difficult
of
position
themselves.
to be in. That would be such a
Yeah,
tough, awkward position where you're trying to balance so many things and be so many things to so many people. But
but that's
on
the
the other hand,
problem.
right, that's the problem. Trump, good, bad, and ugly, can just let it rip, and that's starting
That's
to
right.
resonate with people because they want to be able to let it rip. And just in terms of being able to talk to
Well,
their
I think most
neighborhood
people, yeah,
and be their whole messy
absolutely.
selves. So I mean, I think because of
You
that
know,
duopoly, it's possible that the the systemic flaws to the public are worse than the flaws of the individual and their view.
After the 2020 election, I remember seeing Al Gore on one of the late night TV shows. And the question that someone asked him was, would you do anything differently? And his response was very interesting. He said, my plane used to drop down in a city, and I would be briefed on what people in that community wanted. This is what you should talk about. This is what you should not talk about. He said, if I were to do it again, I should have kicked all of them out, and I should have landed and talked about what was in my heart and my mind and my gut at that time. And I've seen that in my own career. People can smell a deep level of honesty, and they can smell a deep level of dishonesty in their thoughts and says. But then on the other hand, there are a lot of lies that Donald Trump tells that people are for whatever reason not recognizing. But there's an authenticity level that I think people are craving, like you said.
Yeah. And in your campaign, one of the ideas that really struck me was this Department of Peace. I once heard an idea similar
Mhm.
to that from a woman named Peace Pilgrim. Do you remember
Yeah, of course,
uh,
of course, of course.
Peace
Yeah, it's all
Pilgrim
part of
and
that
her?
same legacy. And for sure,
Yeah, and how she was
for
walking
sure.
and during these wars, from the
All the
Korean
way
War
across the
to the
country.
Vietnam War.
Yeah,
Yes, yes, like,
absolutely.
and it's just such
But
a beautiful concept because again, it thinks deeper about war and how any violence or any military conflict inherently violates the rights of people, the dignity of people. Um, what are some of the ideas that were inspiring this as a way to approach like the problems between nations? And I think this is a way to like scale your message of love or even the message of Jesus to individuals, but all the way up to the level of nations?
Well, first of all, let's look at the entire paradigm.
Hmm.
So we now recognize that sickness is not that sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. So the first thing you recognize is that war is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. So you don't just treat sickness, you proactively cultivate health. And you don't, if you really want peace in the world, you can't just try to eliminate your Defense Department budget, as important as that might be, and so forth. You need to proactively create peace. Peace creation is a real thing, and there are ways to do that. So there are 4 factors which statistically indicate when present, there will be a greater incidence of peace and a lower incidence of violence. The main ways the US government perpetrates violence is through dropping bombs and building prisons. Okay, now the four factors, whether you're talking about a corner of an American city or another corner of the world, are increased economic opportunities for women, increased educational opportunities for children, reduction of violence against women, and the reduction of unnecessary human despair. Now, what do all 4 of those have in common? Number 1, they increase the possibility of a sustainable world. Number 2, they in and of themselves produce no corporate profits. So as long as our new organizing principle is trickle down neoliberalism, free market fundamentalism, then the governing principle has become short-term profit maximization, overriding humanitarian and democratic ideals, even overriding, it is so ethically neutral, it even overrides an intention for the species to survive. In other words, there are forces of great power that would rather risk nuclear war than have a reasonable conversation about what might create a greater probability of the species surviving for another 100 years. Because when JFK said we will end war or war will end us, he wasn't just being metaphorical. There's no metaphor there, there's a deep reality. So I read a book a few years ago by Ronan Farrow called The War on Peace. And it was very interesting because the whole idea of a peace department, right now, our military budget is almost $1 trillion a year. I mean, that's so extraordinary if you think about it. And no Democrat or Republican, Trump, Biden, none of them are talking about lessening it. It'll be interesting to see if the Department of Governmental Efficiency tries to take that one on. That tells you everything you need to know. They haven't
Yeah,
mentioned
I'll be
that.
waiting.
Okay. Well, actually, I take that back. Musk did say something about Boeing, but yeah, he did. But in general, the point remains the same. Okay.
Sure.
The issue there is that when you're talking about, let's say, the State Department budget. So the State Department is diplomacy. It's a fraction of the Defense Department budget, right? And Ronan Farrow in that book, War on Peace, says something that stayed with me. He said, if it were 25 years ago and the president was around a conference table and they were talking about an issue of foreign affairs, you would have the diplomats mainly from State Department who are at the table. And then around the room, you know how sometimes you're at a meeting and then there are people sitting on the wall, against the wall around the corner of power? That would be the military people. He said, today it's the opposite. The military people are at the conference table and the diplomats and so forth are sitting on the outside against the wall. I thought that said everything. And he said, years ago, if you were at a table discussing with military, not just military, but national security advisors, any foreign situation, and somebody suggested something, then if somebody piped up and said, oh, we have to run that by state, I'm not sure State Department will be okay with that. People will go, okay, well, somebody needs to check with the Secretary of State's office and what do they think about this? He said, today, if they were planning some military something and somebody said, well, shouldn't we run that by state? He said, the answer would be more likely to be, oh, I'm scared. Like, it doesn't matter what they think. So the
So
Department of
yeah.
Peace was not just international also. To me, the Department of Peace and the activities of peace creation apply as much to a corner of an American city. And that's part of what makes it unique. But you're not going to have that until you have the kind of president and
I
government
think you
who.
make a really crucial point that I hope listeners will really contemplate, and that is it's not a blanket condemnation of capitalism nor an unqualified endorsement of socialism, that there are mismatches between the private and public sectors. Like
Mhm.
in privatized health, the way that we privatize it, obviously profitability hinges on chronic illness. In privatized defense, the profitability you're saying hinges on endless wars. And same with justice. When you privatize the prisons, it incentivizes longer sentencing. It incentivizes these, obscene amount of arrests annually. There's 10 million arrests. There's 2 million incarcerated persons. So
First of
getting
all,
these aligned better is a huge part of what you're saying, I think.
well, your point is certainly well taken. And also there's a little irony there. When it comes to prison population, Trump leans more enlightened than you might think. Because
Can you
you
explain?
look
Yeah.
at places, isn't that odd? You look at places like Texas, where you'd expect it the least, but because of how expensive it is to keep that many people incarcerated, they are trying to cut down on the prison population with such things as programs that would decrease recidivism, et cetera. It's very interesting. When I was
Right.
in Michigan and I was very involved with these kinds of issues, I learned from experience that, for instance, if somebody was unfairly incarcerated and you were trying to get their sentence commuted by a governor, you had more of a chance of being listened to and your argument heard out by a Republican president, a governor, than by a Democratic governor. A Democratic governor was so afraid of being seen as not hard enough on crime, where a Republican president was saying, we're spending too much on that penal system. Can we get anybody out of here so the state won't have to pay for it? So it's so interesting where sometimes the financial incentives, like you said, one financial incentive that the left has always pointed out is building more prisons. But there's also a financial incentive from another perspective, which sometimes someone like President Biden, Trump can see in having fewer people incarcerated so that the state doesn't have to spend so much money.
Right. I mean, sometimes his intuitions in terms of finance or narcissism like intersect with what might actually
Yes,
be better.
exactly.
It's
He
like a
ends up
broken
doing the
clock
right
strikes
thing for the
twice.
wrong reasons, right?
If you take like the defense side or the medical side, I mean the private sector makes the drugs and the bullets. And the tragic irony of that is that they need bodies for them to go into to actually justify their existence as a corporation. I think another insidious layer of complexity to what you're outlining is the bait and switch of pensions with employers to 401ks. Now we have this dialectical, as employees, this dialectical stake, you could say, in our own demise, which makes it hard for people to think clearly. So I do think this kind of money, corroding the politics is what voices I think like you have been really just trying to get people to think about. And of course, Bernie Sanders, but they're so terrified of it, and so that tells me, or that begs the question, is it time to just think bigger than the duopoly, or should people just really start fighting for issues and not see the Democratic Party in the same way? What's your takeaway on that, like after these two elections?
Well, first of all, if we had a parliamentary system, it would certainly be easier, but we don't. And that's not going to change anytime in the foreseeable future. If you look at this historically, third-party voices had much more influence. Abolition emerged from the Abolitionist Party, women's movement from the Women's Party, Social Security, it came from the Socialist Party. Back in the 1960s, mainly in response to the popularity of George Wallace, the Democrats and the Republicans formed this kind of unholy alliance, making it very difficult for anyone of a third party to even be heard. You saw this with the suppression of Ralph Nader in terms of the presidential debates and so forth. So it's very difficult right now. Also, the same kind of throwing them off ballots that you saw with Bobby when he was in the Democratic Party, when you saw with me in the Democratic Party during the primaries. Then they were also doing big time to Bobby when he was out, when he was not Democratic candidate, as well as with Jill Stein. I think a lot of people don't know how that works, this whole thing about kicking you off the ballot. So a Secretary of State who is in charge of elections in any given state, the Secretary of State says to the party, who you got? Who do you want on the primary ballot? And what was happening all across this country is that the Democratic national, not the national, but the state party chief was saying, oh, Joe Biden. And so some secretaries of state said, wait a minute, what about, yeah, Bobby Kennedy, what about Dean Phillips? And what about Marianne Williamson? We've been reading about them. And the Democratic Party person would say, no, we just want Joe Biden. And we would yell and we would scream. I remember at a Zoom call with the Democratic head of the Democratic Party in North Carolina, may I speak? May I speak? These people were cutthroat. Now in Wisconsin, they kicked me and Dean off. Dean had the money to override it with a court case. We didn't have the money to do that. I was kicked off in North Carolina. I think he was as well. They did all kinds of shenanigans in Florida to keep us off. And then the one place where the Secretary of State, who is in Massachusetts called the Secretary of Commonwealth, said to the head of the Democratic Party there, we see what you're doing. No, we're putting them on as well. And Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson both got put on. That's how cutthroat it is. If your way of treating your opponent is just to try to get them kicked off the ballots rather than engaging in a real debate, and I think that I welcome the opportunity to explain to a lot of people how this works, because I think a lot of people don't
Yeah,
understand.
please keep
Uh-huh.
explaining because
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people understand. And if you
Yeah.
don't have much information or you don't have time to digest, some of the process, it's important for like my listeners to hear from you to understand like how this
Yeah,
works.
people, all the facts have been another thing. I remember you would be about to work with a vendor, and then the vendor would call back, say, I'm so sorry, but I'm not going to be able to do it. Why? Because they had gotten a call from the Democratic Party. You not work with her. Another one, I remember I was about to speak at Harvard of all places, and the kids who had invited me there, the students were all excited. And they did an interview with me that was in the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper there. 2 days before the event, canceled. The kids weren't even told why. They just said, you're not having it. They said, we're not having presidential candidates. Like at the Harvard Kennedy School, they're not going to have presidential candidates. No, it is cutthroat. So I thought, well, how is this any different than the Soviet Union, where you get to vote, but the party will determine who you can vote for? Candidate suppression is a form of voter suppression. Now, on the other hand, looping back to what you and I were talking about before, well, if we don't have the Democratic Party, what do we do? I don't think people have, I know people would say to me, well, if you knew it was happening, why didn't you just go independent? Do you know how much money is involved in that? I said to Bobby Kennedy, who I know, I said, Bobby, if I had your name and I had your money that, when Nicole Shanahan came in, I would have gone independent as well. The enormity. And then even he, with all that money she was putting in, found it too difficult to overwhelm the institutional resistance. And of course, at that point, he, supported Trump. And I think Bobby's support made it was of huge help to Trump
I
in
think
winning
it
the
was
election.
too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we could also agree that the Republican Party is not the Republican Party anymore. And
No, both parties are just not what they were. It's not, and that's how I feel about the Democratic Party. This isn't the party I grew up with. And I know a lot of Republicans say it's not the party I grew up with. And I think a lot of us on the Democratic side are living now with this, oh my God, what do we do? But that goes back to what you said before. We don't have to know what to do right now. We have to forge in the sort of field of energy what the politics of the future needs to look like. Form follows consciousness and not the other way around.
do you feel like, in a spiritual sense, that that was part of whatever was calling to your heart to participate in the macro sphere, let's say, that it's just, you know, contributing to the transformation, when you look back now
Well,
with
what
all
I
the hurdles
think,
that you faced?
John O'Donohue has a poem where he says, I think it was John O'Donohue, a poem, he said, find the insight in any moment. I think that no matter what, whether you succeed or you fail, uh, I think the only ultimate failure is a failure to learn from something. There was a lot for me to learn, a lot for me to own, a lot for me to take responsibility for, a lot for me to forgive other people for. So I get that. But also with what I've been through, I do feel there's some things that I feel I can communicate to people and educate to people about that I wouldn't know if I hadn't been there. Like that business of how do you get kicked off the ballot? Well, you get kicked off the ballot because the head of the Democratic Party in that state tells the Secretary of State. I mean, that's so. Now, I'll tell you something even more that I think is really important, and people should keep your eyes open. I read today that on January 1st, January 4th, I think, they're going to have a panel with the people. I think it's Martin O'Malley, and then it's the Democratic Party chief from Minnesota, the Democratic Party chief from Wisconsin, and elsewhere. I don't know who else running for chairman of the Democratic Committee. Chairman of the Democratic Committee will have absolutely a lot to do with whether or not there's a real culture shift. One of the men running is Ben Wickler, who is the Democratic Party chair in Wisconsin. That man was a huge perpetrator of ballot suppression, access to ballots for anybody that wasn't Joe Biden. If they choose Ben Wickler, then that tells us sort of everything we need to know. The new Democratic Party chairman would, I would hope, be someone who understands the deep level of inquiry and humility. You know what the new DNC chair should do? Should go on a listening tour. First thing he does, which I assume it'll be he because so far I've only read about men running, he should go on a listening tour. And he should invite not only Democrats to share their, and I mean voters, not operatives, not donors, or a $10 donor, a $25 donor, because that person is every bit as invested. I remember I almost broke out in tears once. I think it was in my 2020 campaign, but I know there was a lot of this in 24. When I read a note from someone who had just donated $10 to my campaign. Here's 10, and when I get paid again, I'll send you another 10. And the truth of the matter is the person who can afford $10 is probably more affected by environmental policies, food policies, economic policies than the donor who's just affected on, cutting their taxes, right? So I think that the party chair should be listening to Democratic voters. Where do we go wrong? And should be listening to Republican voters, especially all those millions of Republican voters who say, I used to be a Democrat. They have lost the working people of the United States. And the process was begun by Ronald Reagan, and Trump has completed the task. The Democrats have to do more than have better messaging. They have to do more than have better organization. They need to really be humble, a kind of atonement for having so swayed from their own values and their own commitment to democracy in their own house. And then they can pull it off. But like you said, right now, the autopsy, I thought for a few days it might be different, but
Right. But that really does speak to the politics of love to say this isn't good enough. What we've been doing isn't good enough. I mean, trying to massage economic numbers to make people feel like, well, maybe I'm just the only one who's struggling. I mean, there's nothing more salient than this. The the median home buyer in 2024 is 58 years old. The median first time home buyer in America is 38 years old. So no matter what you tell us about prices or jobs or unemployment rates, that means for more than half of a person's life, they can't
they can't
get
get into the
access to the
game.
basic dignity, to the basic American dream. And whoever cannot deliver on that promise is failing. And this
With right
has
now, it's
to
both of
accept it.
them, both of them, both of them.
Exactly.
The average American couple in the 1970s could afford a home, and that means people younger than 38 as well. They could afford a house, they could afford a car, they could afford a yearly vacation, they could afford to send their kids to college. They could even afford for one parent to stay home if they chose. And there has been that $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90%. A Republican president started it, but no Democrat has stopped it.
I mean, there it is. So it's like if you can't give people access to healthy, quality food at affordable prices, access to healthcare, and access to safety in their own home and in a vibrant community, what is our money going to? right?
Well, we do know where it's going. It's going woo.
Right.
Um, yeah. And also, I think, Franklin Roosevelt said we would not have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. And what you're pointing out there is
I mean, there it
democracy is
is.
not delivered for people. What are the, you have so many young people saying, what has global capitalism ever done for me? And so many young people who, in their experience, the Democratic Party hasn't done anything more for them than the Republican Party did.
It's a hierarchy of needs assessment. When people can't afford food, they don't. I mean, what does it do to the morale of the country when parents across this country know that no matter what they do or how hard they work, they can't give their children a better life? It
That's right.
feels like a total violation of the natural order of things.
I think it is a violation of the natural order. And I think that at this point, if you have even a basic understanding of history, you know that there's never been a time in which this didn't occur. If you have large groups of desperate people, they form a petri dish out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction becomes inevitable. And that includes ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. Why are we acting so surprised that Trump exists? If it hadn't been Trump, it would have been someone else. When you have that
I mean,
much
that's how I talk
hopelessness,
about it too. Like,
will go with false hope before they'll go with no hope. And you were talking about acknowledging people's pain. That, it's interesting because in the 2016, two people acknowledged people's pain, acknowledged the system was rigged against them, Bernie and Trump. And the Democratic Party didn't
right.
want to let Trump in. I mean, didn't want to let Bernie in.
Well, and
And,
I think the more
he
they
at
double
least,
down on the demonization of anyone who would say, "Well, I don't know what else to do," we're not going to get any closer. To your point. Go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
no, I agree with you. I like talking to you. The
It's both
conversation
talking
that
to
you
you. I
and I are
appreciate
having,
it.
I think there are so many people who are ready to have these conversations.
And there's a lot of spiritual people too. I think like this is a spiritual podcast and mental health podcast. They are well intentioned, and I think that that's what you were just saying, that there are people on the so-called right, even terms right and left are only pejoratives now.
Get out of the
Right? Nobody
silos.
thinks
Just
of
get
themselves
out.
as a left or a
It doesn't
rightist.
help. It doesn't
We're
help
just
at this
humans
point.
trying to,
Mhm,
trying to make ends
mhm.
meet.
Not only is there real pain on the right, let's say if you're on the left, and not only do they have real pain, they also have real intelligence. A lot of people, I know some very smart people who voted for Trump. It's not, we all have things to learn. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. There are high-minded conservative values and high-minded liberal values. How can you say to a person who, this is not that they lack intelligence, this is simply their circumstance. Gasoline costs so much. They're already working at a job where their job, just showing up every day, they're still on a level of economic survival. But now the price of gas is completely eating into their ability to survive. I understand why they're attracted to somebody who says, drill, baby, drill.
Again, I mean, you make a great point. This is still a hierarchy of needs. How can I be concerned about my great grandchildren and their
That's
safety on this
right. It
planet if I
sounds
don't know
very
how to feed my
elite.
current children? It
That's
sounds so
exactly
tone
right.
deaf to say
That's
we've got to build
exactly
more
right.
windmills. And so it's like
Well,
whatever we got to do to be able to survive right now.
whatever we have to do. And I think that's why they're willing to, what you and I
Right.
might see as an ethical compromise, they're saying, fuck you, lady. I want to feed my kids. I want to have a safe neighborhood, and so forth.
and and
And
and you know
I'm humbled a
really
few
like
times.
people all have these interpretations now, which is probably their pet issue about why the election went the way it did, but I really think it dovetails with all of this. You have a certain level of distress tolerance when we have this economic crisis, so all of a sudden these other issues feel like the straw that's breaking your back. But I would gather that if times were good, if there was prosperity, people would go up the hierarchy of needs. They would start instinctively thinking about the future, the planet. But you have
People
to
used to
start
have
with that
time.
base.
People would
Right.
have bandwidth. People used to come home and they had the
Bandwidth,
time and the
exactly.
world was different and they would sit on their front porches and they would talk to their neighbors and the kids could play safely in the streets in front of the house and the neighbors are talking. And you had people like Walter Cronkite on television who you knew you could trust. People, all the dots have been so confused now that people,
Absolutely. And you could
and
go
I
to
think there's,
places that were local places. There's no
yeah,
like local and grassroots vibrant movements in the economy. It's only chains. You can't afford to rent a place to do your own. So how can you give also? How can people be generous? And when you can't be the generous spirit that I think like really is in every heart,
right,
it confuses or it brings a
right,
cloud over everything
right.
and makes
And that's
people
why.
seem like more villainous than they really are because they start thinking in the survival mode that you're describing.
Well, I think that what you just said is interesting. Is it that people are more villainous than they actually are? Or is it not that we need to be far more psychologically astute and recognize that anybody can become a villain if life is hard enough? There is a little bit of a villain in all of us. It's easier to be
This
generous
is
when you have
that
a lot of
this
cash
is
on
that
hand.
shadow work that's so important. And
Mm-hmm.
like for each of
Mm-hmm.
us in our own heart
Mm-hmm.
and at every level of groupthink and
Mm-hmm.
at the scale
Yeah,
of our
like
nation.
shows like Survival, shows like Hunger Games. I mean, that's why the current politics is such an inadequate mode of response to the challenges that face us now. It lacks the psychological and emotional astuteness that is necessary. You know, one of the problems with the left, and it's not the left I grew up with, it's the left today is a very different animal. I don't see the spine and the courage I used to see, for one thing. I don't see the we're going to gain political power and try to really use the electoral system. Um, I see a lot of, well, I don't know if I like that person or whatever high school drama, but it's also become very over secularized, very condescending, patronizing towards, if you were mentioned Jungian psychology or spirituality, etc. If you refuse to recognize the inner life, and a lot of it is this sort of neo-Marxist class analysis, which within a certain context, I admire as much as anyone. Some of these people, these young people seem to think they're the first generation to read Chomsky. They seem to think they're the first generation to read the Communist Manifesto. I assure you they're not. The point is, that's not the whole story. But if you refuse to acknowledge any dimension of the inner life, you don't understand evil. And if you don't understand evil, which is core to fascism, then you have no clue how to deal with it. And you keep trying to deal with it on the level of the symptom, which makes the devil laugh, which makes that
Yeah.
aspect of the mind just, I can deal with that. Hello. And
And
it
this is
runs
where
all.
the holistic and new vision and nuance comes in. We wouldn't blame
Absolutely.
a flower for not blossoming. We would
Exactly.
look at the
Uh-huh.
conditions and start to address
Uh-huh.
the conditions.
Yeah, they're just saying how bad he is rather than trying to understand what is he doing?
That's what's
Uh,
missing. Are people
Yeah,
really trying to understand,
yeah. I
right?
mean, I'm
And
kind
taking
of
the time.
when I saw that Joe Rogan interview, I was like, this is fascinating. This is you have to understand and you have to see. Also, I'll tell you something else that's interesting to me. I'm old enough to remember who Donald Trump was in the 1980s.
Okay.
If you look at old interviews of his, like with
I
people
have
like,
recently.
isn't it kind of mind blowing? You go, well, that guy wasn't so bad. That guy,
Right.
that he
And the
was a
way
little,
he was treated when he wasn't running, right, by the darlings of the establishment, the
but
media
also
darlings.
some of what he said. I mean, he was a little left of center. If you had said to me in the mid 80s, Donald Trump is going to be president one day, I would probably have said, oi, but that would have been the extent of it. He was kind of vulgar, obviously grandiose, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't someone that you had this, and there is a movie out now that is live streamed called The Apprentice about his relationship with Roy Cohen. I mean, obviously he shifted in a lot of ways, but To underestimate his to underestimate him is foolish. I think they finally get that now, but also to underestimate the intelligence or the decency of many of the people who voted for him is equally foolish as well as wrong, morally wrong.
Also, in the previous election, I believe there's 81 million votes for Joe Biden, and obviously a significant decrease for Kamala. But the shift for Trump was actually quite marginal, I think, like
Mm-hmm.
1 to 2 million votes. So I think that, just to try to like synthesize everything you're sharing, that there's really a big story in why we didn't get over 80. And I think
I
that is an inclusive conversation, a robust dialogue to be had there about what's going on there. Because even if we had 3 million of that 8 or 9 million, it would have been enough too.
I said throughout my campaign, there are millions of people in this country for whom the only way to say fuck you to the system is to simply not vote.
And you cannot underestimate what that means to a lot of people, the
That
protest
was a
vote
statement in and
or
of
the or
itself. It's
or
like
the
I cannot
non-vote, right?
participate in this puppet show. I cannot participate in the way the system is playing me. I know that neither one of you are going to help me. I will not even participate.
Right, and not to empathize with some of those people's pain or families that feel deeply hurt or adjacent to pain in this administration, and to think, well, we can just, look past that, wherever it is in the campaigning in Michigan or in the DNC, it has to be inclusive in the conversations of to understand and to atone and to work together to solve the problems, but it's just not there. And I hope what you're saying and what we're talking about will keep rippling, Marianne. I think listening to you and going deeper into this, it does like ignite a lot more hope in my heart in the
Well, I
wake of
feel
the
the
shift.
same way about you and about a lot of people I've been talking to on podcasts such as yours recently. Uh, I feel the same way about you. I mean, if there are as many
Appreciate
people
that.
as I've seen going deep, being real, not just giving DNC talking points, merging the spiritual understanding. You know, when integrative medicine, it wasn't your metaphysical support group or your doctor, it was both and. That's why it's called integrative. It's both and. And it's your political car mechanic and it's someone pointing out the problem is we're on the wrong road. So I do hear that from you. I hear deep psychological. We have a whole generation of people ready for a real deep dive into the spiritual, the moral, the psychological, the emotional, and the political levels of, I'm sorry to say, malfunction. We have moved beyond dysfunction to malfunction. But sometimes it takes things getting to that point before wisdom starts squeezing itself up. And I think that's happening. I used to say, uh, it's the 11th hour, but it's not midnight yet. Now it's worse than that. It's like 11:55, but a lot of things, a lot of magic and a lot of miracles can happen in those next 5 minutes. I believe that.
I love that. A lot of magic happens right before midnight. Well, I
Hmm.
want to be respectful of your time, Marianne, but so we can wrap up soon, but there's a line that really resonated with me from your book about the metaphor of a hologram. And I think for spiritual people or seekers, um, it's a way to really hold these two ideas together that
Hmm.
yes, there's a world and there's all these problems, but that's not all there is to life, to consciousness. And if we live like that as multidimensional beings, yes, we have to go in, connect with the big battery, so to speak, draw that wisdom and love and energy and bring it, to every moment at every level. But that is still always with us. And I think that's also the message that you're sharing with the mysticism. Does that sound
Absolutely.
accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. And,
There's light and
people,
there's
yeah,
diversity and
you
there's
know,
unity.
people say, well, it's all locked up. Well, you're not the first generation who felt that way. There have always been times like these. The slave owners had it locked up too, and the abolitionists unlocked it. And those who were perpetrating institutional suppression of women, they had it all locked up. And the women suffragists unlocked it. And the Gilded Age was all locked up, and the early labor movement unlocked it. Segregation was all locked up, and the civil rights movement unlocked it. Sometimes I feel like our ancestors would be just leaping up from their graves and saying, "Don't be so wimpy. Don't be so wimpy." And we have to, like I said, the left today needs spine and courage. And then, you know what? Anger, cheap anger, putting down people who don't agree with you. That's not
Mm.
courage. That's not spine.
I
Um,
agree with that. And maybe this is where like these spaces I think are going to become vital, where
mhm,
like it's this is the new media where people actually hear people just talk and be
right,
able to talk honestly, to open their
right,
heart, to bare their
right.
soul a little bit. Maybe that's part of the transformation where like you get that top-down messaging from the legacy media, but people are tuned out. They're not listening,
I
especially
don't
as
think
younger people move into to this space
it's not
and a
just
big part of the demographic.
it's not just part of it, it's essential to it.
Yeah,
It's central to it. It's a decentralization of power. CNN and MSNBC, and but then there's a lot of that same kind of corruption within the independent media space now too. Everybody wants their clicks and their own brand protection and all that kind of stuff. But then there are the people who are just saying, well, we just need to talk. So
we
thank you for
just need to
giving me
talk.
this opportunity. It's
Yeah,
been
I
great to talk
appreciate
to
you
you.
so much, and I appreciate your time. Is there a best way that people can follow your
Yes,
work and
yes,
find the book and stay in touch with
yes.
your vision?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I appreciate that you mentioned Marianne2024.com just for people to see what those issues were. But in terms of my regular work, Marianne.com, Marianne, Marianne.com.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I
Thank
hope we
you so
can
much.
stay connected and speak again in the future.
I hope so too. God bless you, honey.
Thank you.
Thank you.